I'm sorry, sir. It didn't go through.
That's strange. Try it again.
Expensive suit, declined card.
There must be a problem with the bank.
Excuse me, I'll pay for him.
No, you really don't have to.
It's only breakfast. Everyone needs a little kindness sometimes.
The little bell above the diner door chimed softly as Eric Davidson stepped inside, tie loosened, mind still half in the boardroom he'd just walked out of. It was the kind of place he liked precisely because no one there had any reason to recognize him. A worn counter, mismatched chairs, the smell of coffee and bacon grease. He took a seat at the register and ordered the simplest thing on the menu. Michelle Harris rang it up with the easy, practiced warmth of someone who'd learned to make even a rushed lunch order feel like it mattered. "That'll be $12.50, she said, sliding the receipt toward him. Eric reached for his wallet out of habit, pulled a card, and handed it over without a second thought. Michelle swiped it. Pause. A beep. Declined. "Let me try that again," she said, glancing up with an apologetic smile, the kind meant to smooth over an awkward moment before it became one. She ran it a second time. The machine beeped again, flat and final. Eric frowned, checked the card in his hand, his old backup, expired months ago, one he hadn't bothered to remove from his wallet. He reached for his other pocket. Nothing. Then the inside of his jacket. Still nothing. That was when it hit him. He'd left his real card behind, where exactly he couldn't yet place because his morning had been a blur of one urgent thing after another. "I'm sorry," he said, quieter now, aware of the diner's usual clatter thinning into something closer to silence. A few heads had turned. Someone near the window had stopped mid-sentence. For a man who had negotiated in rooms full of far more intimidating people, the sudden attention of a dozen strangers in a diner felt strangely, disproportionately heavy. "I honestly don't know what happened," he said. "I must have left my card somewhere this morning." Michelle opened her mouth to offer some solution, a tab, maybe, or a manager's override, when a voice spoke from the small table behind him. "I'll pay for his breakfast." Eric turned. A woman in a modest cardigan, a stack of grocery coupons and a worn calculator sitting in front of her, was already reaching into her bag. She stepped up to the register and set her own card down on the counter before he could say a word. "You don't have to do that," Eric said. "I know," she said simply. "It's only breakfast. You don't even know me." She smiled, unbothered. No one deserves to be embarrassed over $12. Michelle processed the payment and the woman, whose name Eric hadn't even caught yet, picked up her bag and returned to her table like nothing unusual had happened at all. Eric sat there a moment, receipt in hand, feeling something unfamiliar settle over him. He'd built a career on being the person quietly solving other people's problems from a distance. He hadn't expected even once to be on the receiving end of that kind of ordinary grace, and from someone who, by the look of the coupons on her table, had far less to spare than he did. He knew, without fully understanding why, that he wasn't leaving this diner without learning her name. 1 hour earlier, Eric Davidson had 11 minutes before the most important board meeting of the year. His driver was already circling the block. His assistant had called twice, her voice climbing a half step of urgency each time. Every minute mattered that morning. The community investment vote alone represented the largest philanthropic commitment his company had ever proposed, and half the board still needed convincing. He should have gone straight to the car. Instead, on his way out, he noticed an elderly man in a faded army cap standing at the pharmacy counter, patting down his pockets with the particular stillness of someone trying not to draw attention to a problem. The pharmacist offered a gentle, practiced apology. The card had been declined. Twice. The old veteran began quietly setting items back on the counter. A bag of bread, a bottle of blood pressure medication, a carton of milk. Each one returned like it cost him something larger than money to give up. Eric stepped forward before he'd fully decided to. "Put it all back on the counter," he said. "I'll cover it." The man turned, startled, already shaking his head. "Son, I can't ask you to." "You're not asking," Eric said. "I'm offering." He paid for everything. The medication, the groceries, a few extra items he quietly added himself, and was already moving toward the door by the time the man found the words to thank him. His phone buzzed again. His assistant again. He answered it walking, already 3 steps into the parking lot, already thinking about the board meeting waiting for him. Neither man noticed the wallet Eric had set down on the pharmacy counter to sign the receipt, and never picked back up. The board meeting ran long, contentious in places, one director pushing to cut community funding in favor of a cleaner quarterly number. Eric listened to the arguments without interrupting, the way he always did, and when the room finally quieted, he said only one thing. If growing this company means forgetting who helped build it, then we're chasing the wrong kind of success. The vote passed unanimously. He left the building an hour later, tie loosened, mentally worn thin, and told his driver he wanted coffee somewhere quiet before heading back to the office. That was how he ended up at the diner. That was how his empty wallet ended up costing him a public moment of embarrassment he hadn't experienced in years. And that was how Michelle Harris ended up paying for the meal of a man worth more money than she would likely see in several lifetimes, without either of them having the faintest idea how much that single decision was about to change. Eric couldn't stop thinking about her. Not in the way he thought about business problems, turning them over methodically until a solution presented itself, but in a quieter, more persistent way, the memory of her simply walking back to her table like she hadn't just done something remarkable. The next morning he told his driver to take him back to the same diner. He told himself it was only coffee. He almost believed it. Michelle was behind the counter when he walked in, and something in her face shifted with recognition the moment she saw him. "You're back," she said. "And you have a wallet this time, I hope." Eric laughed more easily than he had in weeks. "I do. I'd like to pay you back if that's all right." "It's not necessary." "I know it's not necessary. I'd still like to." Michelle studied him for a moment, then shrugged, the corner of her mouth lifting. "Fine. You can pay for your own coffee today. That's as close to repayment as I'm willing to accept." He sat at the counter, and to his own surprise he stayed far longer than he'd planned. She told him about a regular customer who tipped exclusively in exact, carefully counted pennies. About the time a toddler had gotten loose behind the counter and nearly ended up in the soup pot. She laughed easily, the kind of laugh that didn't seem to require anything from the person listening, and Eric found himself laughing along without the practiced caution he usually brought into every conversation with a stranger. She asked what he did for work and he told her simply that he ran an office, true enough technically and vague enough that she didn't press further. She seemed to take people at face value, uninterested in titles or resumes, more curious about whether someone was decent to be around than what they did for a living. He left that morning smiling in a way he couldn't remember doing in longer than he wanted to admit. For a man whose calendar was measured in 15-minute increments of shareholder value, the idea of looking forward to something as small as tomorrow's coffee felt disorienting, almost suspicious in its simplicity. But he looked forward to it anyway. Over the following days, he found himself rearranging meetings around a stop that had no business being on his calendar at all. His assistant noticed the new gap in his schedule and wisely chose not to ask about it. His driver, less discreet, raised an eyebrow every time he pulled up outside the same modest diner 2 days in a row, then 3, then most mornings of the week. Michelle never treated him any differently than she treated anyone else who sat at her counter. No extra attention, no curiosity about his finances, no subtle fishing for information about his life beyond what he offered freely. She simply talked to him like a person, which Eric was beginning to realize was rarer in his life than he'd ever noticed before now. One morning she mentioned offhand that her son had a school project due and she hadn't had time to help him finish it the night before because of a double shift. "He's smart," she said, wiping down the counter without looking up. "Smarter than he gives himself credit for. I just wish I had more hours in a day to prove it to him." Eric filed that detail away carefully, the way he filed away every small thing she said, though he wasn't yet sure what he intended to do with any of it. What he did know, walking back out onto the sidewalk that morning, was that something in him had shifted since the day his card had failed in front of a room full of strangers. He'd spent years quietly fixing other people's problems from a comfortable distance, writing checks he never had to watch land, funding programs he never had to see change a single life up close. Michelle didn't know anything about that version of him. She only knew the version who sat at her counter most mornings, tipped generously but not suspiciously so, and laughed at her stories about difficult customers. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Eric Davidson wasn't sure which version of himself he preferred being. His assistant, Grace Whitfield, noticed the shift before anyone else did. She'd worked for him for 6 years, long enough to read the small changes in his schedule the way other people read weather patterns. "You've had the same 9 a.m. gap blocked out for 2 weeks, she said one morning, sliding his calendar across the desk. "Should I stop trying to fill it?" "Yes," Eric said without offering further explanation. Grace studied him a moment longer than professional curiosity strictly required. "Whoever she is," she said carefully, "I haven't seen you this distracted by anything that wasn't a hostile takeover in years." Eric didn't correct her, mostly because he wasn't entirely sure she was wrong. At the diner, meanwhile, Michelle had begun noticing her own small shift in routine. The way she found herself glancing toward the door a few minutes before Eric usually arrived, the way she'd started saving him the seat at the end of the counter without fully deciding to. One morning, a regular customer named Frank, a retired mailman who'd been coming in for coffee every day for 11 years, leaned over conspiratorially while Eric was in the restroom. "That fella's sweet on you," Frank said. "Man doesn't come in here for the coffee. Coffee's terrible, and I say that with love." "He's just a customer," Michelle said, wiping down the counter a little more vigorously than necessary. "Sure," Frank said, grinning into his own cup. "And I'm just here for the ambience." Michelle rolled her eyes, but she found herself smiling the rest of the morning anyway, unable to fully talk herself out of the small flutter of possibility Frank's comment had stirred loose. When Eric returned to his seat, he caught the tail end of her smile and asked what he'd missed. "Nothing," she said. "Frank's just in a mood today." "Frank's always in a mood," Eric said, and Michelle laughed, and neither of them said anything more about it, though something unspoken had settled a little more firmly into place between them by the time he finally stood to leave that morning. Over the following weeks, Eric became something the diner regulars had started to call, half-jokingly, the coffee guy, a fixture at the counter most mornings, sometimes staying for pie in the afternoon if his schedule allowed it, which he began arranging more often than strictly necessary. Short conversations stretched into longer ones. Michelle, slowly, without quite meaning to, began telling him more. She'd been widowed 5 years earlier, she said one slow afternoon, her husband gone in a car accident that still didn't feel entirely real most days. She had an 8-year-old son, Noah, bright and stubborn and endlessly curious about how things worked. She worked the diner counter most days and picked up shifts cleaning offices most nights, stitching together just enough hours to keep their small apartment and keep Noah in the after-school program he loved. "It's not glamorous," she said, with the particular shrug of someone who'd made peace with a hard truth a long time ago. "But it's ours. We manage." She refused, gently but firmly, whenever regular customers tried to leave her extra tips out of pity rather than genuine appreciation. "Dignity's not for sale," she told Eric once, only half joking. "Doesn't matter how tired I am." Eric never told her about his fortune. He told himself it was because it didn't matter to the version of their friendship that existed inside that diner, though some quieter part of him suspected he simply didn't want to see her face change the way faces always changed once people learned the size of his bank account. Instead, he listened. He asked about Noah's science project, about the food pantry Michelle volunteered at most weekends despite having so little margin herself, about the small, specific kindnesses she extended to people who had even less than she did. One afternoon, he watched her quietly slip a to-go container to a homeless woman who'd been sitting outside the diner for an hour, refusing payment when the woman tried, in a small broken voice, to offer the few coins she had. "It's on the house," Michelle told her. "Everybody eats today." Eric sat with that longer than he expected to. He had built an entire philanthropic foundation, employed dozens of people whose sole job was distributing his money to causes that mattered, and yet here was a woman working 2 jobs to keep her own lights on, giving away food she genuinely couldn't spare, without a single camera or press release anywhere in sight. It wasn't charity to her. It was simply how she moved through the world. That night, back in his own apartment, a place too large and too quiet for one person, filled with furniture he'd never personally chosen, Eric sat with his laptop open and didn't touch it for a long while. He thought about how much of his giving had always come from a safe, comfortable distance. Wire transfers. Foundation boards. Ribbon cuttings where he shook hands and left before the crowd thinned. Michelle gave from a place that actually cost her something. And she never once made it about herself. He decided, sitting there in the dark, that he wanted to help her world the way she helped it, quietly, without asking for anything back, without letting his name attach itself to any of it. He just wasn't yet sure how to do that without eventually having to explain who he really was. That evening, back at his own office long after the rest of the floor had emptied out, Eric called his head of philanthropic operations, a careful, discreet woman named Patricia who'd overseen his foundation's quieter projects for years. "I need something set up," he told her, "and I need my name nowhere near it. Not on paperwork, not on plaques, not anywhere it could be traced back easily." "What kind of something?" Patricia asked. "A neighborhood," Eric said. "A specific one. I'll send you the details tonight." Patricia had worked for him long enough not to ask further questions when he used that particular tone of voice, the one that meant he'd already decided something mattered to him personally, in a way his usual philanthropic strategy meetings rarely touched. "I'll need at least a few weeks to structure it properly," she said. Anonymous giving at this scale takes careful legal work if you want it to actually stay anonymous. Take the time you need, Eric said. Just make sure it doesn't come back to me. He hung up and sat alone in his office for a long while afterward, looking out over the city lights, thinking about Michelle's easy, unthinking generosity toward a stranger who had nothing to offer her in return, and how strange it felt to realize that replicating that kind of giving at scale still required lawyers and structuring and careful anonymity to avoid the complications that came with being who he was. Michelle had simply reached for her card. It had cost her nothing to decide and everything to actually give. He wanted, more than almost anything else in his life right now, to give something that simply. Weeks later, when the first anonymous healthcare announcement finally reached the diner staff, Eric sat at the counter watching Michelle's reaction closely, careful to keep his own expression neutral. She'd gone quiet for a long moment after the owner made the announcement, then excused herself to the back for several minutes. When she returned, her eyes were slightly red, though she waved off Eric's concerned glance. "Sorry," she said. "It's just, I've spent 3 years terrified of what would happen if Noah or I ever got seriously sick. Terrified in a way you carry around so long you forget it's even there, until suddenly it isn't anymore." She wiped at her eyes, embarrassed. "Whoever did this has no idea what they actually gave us." Eric wanted more than anything to tell her right then. The words sat right at the edge of his mouth, and for one long moment he almost let them out. Instead, he reached across the counter and squeezed her hand briefly. "I'm glad it happened for you," he said. "You deserve exactly that kind of relief." Michelle smiled, composing herself. "You're a good listener, you know that? Most people don't sit still long enough to actually hear what someone's carrying." "I've been working on it," Eric said, and meant it more than she could have known. The first sign of it arrived on an ordinary Tuesday, when the diner's owner gathered the staff before the morning shift to make an announcement. "Effective this month," he said, visibly moved, "every one of you has full healthcare coverage. Someone, I don't know who, covered the entire cost, no strings attached." Michelle sat with the news for a long moment after the announcement ended, quietly stunned. She'd gone years without proper coverage, budgeting around the risk of it, hoping nothing serious ever happened to her or Noah before she could afford otherwise. "Whoever that is," she said to no one in particular, "God bless them." Eric, sitting at his usual spot with his coffee, said nothing, though something in his chest settled with quiet satisfaction. More began to happen after that, each one seemingly unconnected, each one landing exactly where it was needed most. Noah's school received an anonymous donation of new computers for the library. The neighborhood's aging community center got a full renovation, new roof and all. A scholarship fund appeared out of nowhere, specifically earmarked for children being raised by single parents, Noah among the first names quietly submitted. The local food pantry, the one Michelle volunteered at every weekend, suddenly found its shelves fully stocked for months, along with new refrigeration units that finally let them store fresh produce instead of only canned goods. Nobody in the neighborhood could trace any of it back to a name. Rumors circulated: a tech executive, a retired athlete, a lottery winner who wanted to stay hidden. Michelle simply chose to believe good people still existed in the world, quietly and without needing credit, and left it at that. She mentioned it to Eric one morning, stirring her coffee, genuinely moved. "Whoever's doing all this," she said, "they're not doing it for attention. You can tell. It's always exactly what people actually need, not what would look good in a headline." Eric smiled into his own cup. "Maybe they just pay attention," he said. "Maybe," Michelle agreed. "Still, makes you believe in people a little more." Their friendship, meanwhile, kept deepening in its own unhurried way. Eric found himself telling her small true things about his life. Not the scale of his fortune but real details, the exhaustion of decisions that affected thousands of people, the loneliness of a schedule with no room left in it for anything that didn't produce measurable value. Michelle listened the way she listened to everyone, without judgment, occasionally offering a piece of blunt, practical wisdom that cut through his carefully worded corporate instincts more effectively than any consultant ever had. She still believed he ran an ordinary office job. He let her believe it, telling himself it was only a matter of time before the truth came out on its own, which, given the growing scale of the anonymous donations quietly reshaping her neighborhood, was probably closer to true than he wanted to admit. For now, though, he simply enjoyed being someone Michelle Harris trusted without conditions, without curiosity about his net worth, without ever once asking him for anything beyond his company at her counter most mornings. He was beginning to realize, the most valuable thing anyone had given him in years. One afternoon, Noah's teacher sent home a note about the new computers in the school library, mentioning how several students had already signed up for extra time on them after school. Michelle read the note aloud to Eric at the counter, shaking her head in quiet disbelief. Noah's been asking to stay late every day this week just to use them, she said. Whoever paid for those computers has no idea what they actually did. It's not just computers. It's kids who never had access to anything like that suddenly having a reason to stay curious about something. Eric turned his coffee cup slowly on its saucer. I think whoever did it probably understands more than you'd expect, he said. Michelle glanced at him, something flickering briefly behind her eyes, though she let it pass without comment. Maybe, she said. Still, I hope they know how much it mattered. Later that week, the food pantry director, a stout, warm woman named Carla who'd run the operation for over a decade on a shoestring budget, pulled Michelle aside during her Saturday volunteer shift. You're not going to believe this, Carla said, gesturing toward the newly stocked shelves, the gleaming refrigeration units humming quietly along one wall. We haven't had to turn a single family away in 3 weeks. 3 weeks, Michelle. That hasn't happened since I started this place. Michelle looked around at the fully stocked shelves, throat tight with something she didn't fully have words for. Somebody out there is paying attention, she said. Really paying attention. Not just writing a check and walking away. Carla nodded. Whoever it is, I hope they know exactly what they've built here. Michelle thought about that conversation for the rest of the day, turning it over the way she turned over most things that moved her, quietly, without drama, simply letting it settle into the part of her that still, despite everything life had taken from her, believed the world could occasionally surprise you with something good. That evening, walking home from her shift, she found herself talking it through with Noah, who listened with the particular seriousness he reserved for questions he considered genuinely important. Do you think we'll ever find out who it is? He asked. Maybe, Michelle said. Some people just want to help without anyone knowing. I think that takes a certain kind of person. What kind? Noah asked. Michelle thought about it, unknowingly describing the man currently sitting a few blocks away in his empty apartment, wondering whether he'd ever be able to tell her the truth without losing everything they'd built. The kind who doesn't need anybody to clap for them, she said. The kind who does the right thing just because it's right even when nobody's watching. Noah nodded solemnly, filing the thought away the way he filed away most things his mother told him, with the quiet trust of a child who'd learned, despite hardship, that his mother's judgment about people was almost always something worth believing. I hope I grow up to be like that, he said. Michelle squeezed his hand as they walked. Baby, she said, you already are. Eric finally met Noah on a rainy Saturday afternoon, when Michelle's usual sitter canceled last minute and she reluctantly brought him along to the diner during her shift. Noah took one look at Eric sitting at the counter and, with the total lack of self-consciousness only an 8-year-old possesses, climbed onto the stool beside him and asked whether he knew anything about bridges. A little, Eric said, genuinely amused. Why bridges? I'm building one out of popsicle sticks for the science fair, Noah said. It has to hold a brick without breaking. Mine keeps breaking. By the time Michelle finished her shift 2 hours later, Eric and Noah had covered load distribution, triangle bracing, and, somewhat unrelated but deeply important to Noah, which NBA player had the best free throw form. You're good with him, Michelle said, watching Noah proudly show off a sketch Eric had helped him rough out. He's easy to be good with, Eric said. He asks better questions than most adults I work with. Over the following weeks, Eric became a regular presence in more than just Michelle's mornings. He helped Noah finish the bridge project, which went on to place second at the regional science fair. He showed up, unannounced but always welcome, to shoot baskets at the cracked court near their apartment building. He learned that Noah dreamed of becoming an engineer, that he collected bottle caps for no reason he could fully articulate, that he still slept with a night light because the dark reminded him too much of the year his father died. One evening, sitting at Michelle's small kitchen table over pizza, she apologized for the modest size of the apartment, for the mismatched chairs, for the water stain on the ceiling she hadn't yet been able to afford to fix. I've sat in boardrooms worth more than this entire building, Eric said quietly. I've never felt more at home than I do right here. Michelle looked at him for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind her eyes, before she simply smiled and changed the subject. That night, walking back to his car, Eric understood with sudden clarity just how much weight Michelle carried every single day, invisibly, without complaint, the exhaustion behind her easy laugh at the diner, the careful budgeting behind her refusal of pity tips, the quiet fear behind her insistence that she and Noah were managing just fine. He created an education trust for Noah that week, structured carefully so it wouldn't need to reveal a name attached to it for years, not until Noah was old enough to understand where it had actually come from. But the world outside their small circle was beginning to close in. A local reporter, intrigued by the sudden, unexplained wave of generosity transforming the neighborhood, had started asking questions, quietly interviewing shop owners, school administrators, food pantry volunteers, trying to trace the pattern back to its source. Eric's assistant flagged the article drafts before publication, concern evident in her voice when she briefed him. "They're getting close," she said. "It's only a matter of time before someone connects the dates to your public schedule." Eric sat with that information longer than he expected to, thinking not about the exposure itself, but about Michelle's face the day she finally learned the truth, and whether what they'd built together could survive the moment she realized exactly how much he hadn't told her. That night, Eric called Patricia again. "How close are they?" he asked. "Close enough," Patricia said carefully. "A local reporter's been cross-referencing donation dates against your public schedule for weeks. I'd estimate you have somewhere between a few days and a couple of weeks before someone connects it publicly, if they haven't already privately." Eric sat with the number for a long moment. "I should tell her myself," he said. "Before she reads it somewhere else or hears it from a stranger at that celebration everyone keeps planning. Do you want me to slow the story down?" "I have options," Patricia said. "No," Eric said after a pause. "Let it come. I've hidden enough from her already. I'm not going to add stalling to the list." He hung up and sat alone in the quiet of his apartment, thinking about Noah's bridge project, about the water-stained ceiling Michelle had apologized for as though it were something to be ashamed of, about the particular warmth of an evening spent at her kitchen table that had felt, against every logical expectation of his life, more like home than any of the properties he actually owned. He thought, too, about the version of himself Michelle knew, patient, curious, unhurried, someone who showed up simply because he wanted to, not because a headline or a shareholder report demanded it of him. He wasn't ready to lose that version of himself. But he understood, sitting there in the dark, that he no longer had the luxury of choosing when the truth arrived. All he could still choose was whether she heard it from him first, or from someone else entirely. The following morning he almost told her. He sat at the counter, coffee cooling in front of him, the words arranged and ready, and then Noah burst through the door mid-sentence about a video game tournament, and the moment slipped past before Eric could gather it back. He told himself he'd find another opening. He didn't yet know that the opening would arrive on its own terms, in front of an entire crowd, before he ever got the chance to choose the moment himself. Grace, watching him leave the office early yet again that week, finally asked the question she'd been holding back for months. "Whatever happens with all this," she said carefully, "is it worth it? The risk, I mean. To your public image, to the company." Eric considered the question seriously before answering. "I used to think the company was the whole point," he said. "Lately I'm not sure it ever was." The community celebration had been Michelle's idea originally, a small neighborhood gathering to thank whoever had been quietly transforming their corner of the city, even if that person never stepped forward to claim credit. She spent weeks helping organize it, hanging string lights across the newly renovated community center, coordinating a potluck table long enough to feed half the block. She genuinely expected, if the donor showed up at all, someone older. A retired businessman maybe. Someone comfortably anonymous by nature. The evening of the event, the small crowd gathered under the lights, Noah weaving excitedly between tables with a paper plate of food he wasn't actually eating. Michelle stood near the podium, clipboard in hand, checking off the last details, when the event organizer stepped up to the microphone. "Tonight," the organizer said, "we finally get to thank the person responsible for changing so many lives in this neighborhood. Please welcome billionaire entrepreneur and philanthropist, Eric Davidson." Michelle's clipboard slipped slightly in her grip. She watched Eric walk up to the small stage in a suit far more expensive than anything she'd ever seen him wear at the diner, shaking hands, thanking the crowd with the easy, practiced grace of someone used to rooms far larger than this one. Her mind raced backward, piecing it together in fragments. The declined card that first morning, the coffee visits that had somehow never once touched on what he actually did for a living, the healthcare announcement, the scholarships, the food pantry's overflowing shelves, all of it suddenly slotting into a shape she hadn't let herself see until this exact moment. He wasn't just a customer who'd become a friend. He was the anonymous donor. He'd been the anonymous donor this entire time, sitting across from her at that counter, asking about Noah's science project, telling her he'd never felt more at home than in her small apartment, all while carrying a secret the size of an entire fortune. She wasn't shocked by the money. She'd grown up believing wealthy people existed somewhere far outside her daily life, an abstract fact rather than a personal betrayal. What stung, standing there under the string lights with her clipboard forgotten in her hand, was simpler and far more painful. He'd let her believe she knew him completely. And the whole time, there had been an entire version of his life he'd chosen not to share. She didn't stay for the rest of the ceremony. She slipped through the crowd quietly, collected Noah, and walked home in the cool evening air, her thoughts louder than anything Eric had said from that stage. Behind her, Eric watched her go, the applause from the crowd suddenly feeling distant and unimportant against the sight of her back disappearing down the sidewalk. He cut his remarks short, thanked the crowd as gracefully as he could manage, and stepped down from the podium immediately after, already scanning the thinning gathering for a face he already knew he wouldn't find. She left, Carla told him gently, catching his eye near the refreshment table. Took Noah and went home about 10 minutes ago. She looked pretty shaken, Eric. I need to go after her, he said. Give her tonight, Carla said not unkindly. Whatever you've got to say to her, it'll still be true tomorrow. Tonight, I think she just needs to sit with it. Eric stood there a moment longer, torn between every instinct telling him to fix this immediately and the quieter, harder truth that some things couldn't be fixed on his usual timeline, with his usual resources. This wasn't a board vote he could push through with the right argument. This was a woman who had trusted him with the ordinary, unglamorous parts of her life, only to learn that he'd been carefully editing the ordinary, unglamorous parts of his own. He went home that night without seeing her, sat alone in his too-quiet apartment, and thought about every morning at that counter, every conversation he'd let stay comfortably shallow because the alternative had felt too risky. He'd built his entire fortune on knowing exactly when to act and when to wait. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he had no idea which one this moment actually called for. Michelle, meanwhile, sat at her small kitchen table long after Noah had finally fallen asleep, replaying the entire friendship from the beginning, searching for signs she might have missed. The declined card. The way he'd never once mentioned a company name, a title, an office address. The way he always paid in cash at the diner rather than pulling out a card that might have told her something. Small omissions, she realized now, each one deliberate, each one a quiet decision to keep her on the far side of a line he'd drawn without ever telling her it existed. She wasn't angry that he had money. She'd known plenty of people over the years who'd struggled and plenty who hadn't, and she'd never let a bank balance decide who deserved her respect. What sat heavier in her chest was simpler than that. She'd let herself believe, slowly and against her own better instincts, that she finally understood someone completely. And the whole time, there had been rooms in his life she hadn't even known to look for. She thought about her late husband, about how simple honesty had always been between them, imperfect but complete. She wondered if she'd been foolish to expect that same simplicity from someone whose entire life operated behind layers she couldn't see. By the time she finally went to bed, she hadn't decided anything except that she needed to hear, directly from Eric, why he'd chosen silence over trust for so many months, and whether that choice was something she could actually live with going forward. Noah, half asleep in the next room, called out once before finally drifting off. Mom? Is Eric still going to help me with my next project? Michelle sat with the question a long moment before answering. I don't know, baby, she said softly. We'll figure that out. Eric found her the next evening, sitting on the front steps of her apartment building after Noah had gone to bed, staring out at nothing in particular. Why didn't you tell me? She asked quietly, not looking at him as he approached. He sat down beside her, close enough to matter, far enough to respect the distance she clearly needed. Because everyone who learns who I am sees the billionaire first, he said. The company. The fortune. The foundation. You were the first person in longer than I can remember who never once asked me for anything, or looked at me differently because of what I might be able to give you. I was afraid of losing that the moment you knew. That's not your decision to make for me, Michelle said, her voice steady but edged with real hurt. I'm not upset that you have money, Eric. I don't care about your money. I'm upset that I thought we were being honest with each other, and the whole time, you were choosing exactly how much of yourself to let me see. Eric absorbed that in silence for a moment, because it was true, and there wasn't a version of defending himself that didn't sound smaller than her honesty deserved. You're right, he finally said. I'm sorry. I should have told you a long time ago. He told her then about his mother, a woman who'd raised him with almost nothing, who'd taught him that generosity only counted if it never expected applause. He told her about the long, lonely climb to build his company, the friendships that had quietly evaporated the moment his net worth became public knowledge, the particular loneliness of never being fully sure whether someone valued him or simply valued what he could provide. You were the first person in years who wasn't doing math behind your smile, he said. I know that's not an excuse. I just wanted you to understand where it came from. Michelle listened without interrupting, and slowly, some of the tension in her shoulders eased, though not all of it. I still wish you'd told me, she said. But I understand it a little better now. Can we start over? Eric asked. Not from the beginning. Just from here. Honestly, this time. Michelle looked at him for a long moment, weighing something behind her eyes that Eric couldn't fully read. We can try, she said finally. Neither of them said the word that had quietly been building between them for weeks now, sitting just beneath the surface of every coffee, every conversation, every evening Eric had spent at her small kitchen table. But something had shifted between them that night on the steps, something neither of them was ready yet to name out loud. Before he left, Michelle asked him one more thing, quieter than everything else she'd said that night. Is Noah's education fund real? She asked. Or was that another thing I don't know the whole truth about? It's real, Eric said. It exists whether we're together or not. I set it up because he deserves it, not because of anything I expect in return from him or from you. Michelle nodded slowly, something in her posture easing just slightly at that. Thank you for telling me that directly, she said. That matters more than you probably realize. I'm learning that directness matters more than I used to think it did, Eric said. I spent so long believing the kindest thing I could do was handle things quietly from a distance so no one felt indebted to me. I didn't realize how much that same instinct could feel like being shut out, if you're the person on the other side of it. It can, Michelle said simply. It did. I don't want to be that person with you, Eric said. I don't want there to be a version of my life you don't have access to, just because I've spent years assuming distance was the same thing as kindness. Michelle studied him for a long moment in the porch light, something behind her eyes softening by degrees. Okay, she said finally. Let's actually try that then. No more editing. No more editing, Eric agreed. They sat together a while longer on the steps, the conversation slowly finding its way back to smaller, easier things. Noah's latest obsession with a video game Eric didn't understand, a customer at the diner who'd left an entire poem instead of a tip, until the tension between them had eased into something closer to the comfortable rhythm they'd built over the past several months, even if a few new, careful edges remained. Before he left that night, Michelle asked one more question, quieter than the rest. Does this mean you're going to stop coming to the diner? Now that everyone knows who you are. Eric looked at her, surprised by the question. Why would I stop? Because it's not exactly a low-profile kind of place anymore, she said. People are already talking. Reporters might follow. It won't be quiet and simple like it used to be. I don't need quiet and simple, Eric said. I need you and Noah. The diner was never really the point. It was just where I happened to find you. Michelle studied him a long moment in the porch light. That's a good answer, she said finally. I've been practicing honest answers, Eric said. Turns out they're harder than the polished ones I'm used to giving, but they feel a lot better once they're out. She almost smiled at that, the tension in her shoulders easing another degree. Good, she said. Get used to it. I'm not interested in the polished version anymore. I like this one better. Before he left, Eric paused at the bottom of the steps. For what it's worth, he said, Noah asked about his bridge project earlier tonight before any of this happened. I still want to help him with the next one if that's all right with you. Michelle nodded, something in her expression softening further. He'd like that, she said. So would I. A few weeks later, Eric invited Michelle and Noah to the city's botanical gardens. No expensive restaurant, no reserved table, no staff hovering nearby. Just a simple picnic blanket spread beneath a row of blooming magnolia trees, sandwiches Eric had, somewhat clumsily, made himself. Noah ran ahead chasing a family of ducks near the pond while Eric and Michelle sat together, the late afternoon light filtering gold through the branches above them. The day my card got declined, Eric said, wasn't the worst day of my week, like I assumed it would be. Michelle glanced at him, amused. No. It became the best day of my life, he said simply. Losing that wallet, standing there in front of a room full of strangers with nothing, it led me to something I didn't know I was missing. Someone whose kindness had nothing to do with power or money or who I turned out to be. Michelle was quiet for a moment, turning a blade of grass between her fingers. I almost didn't pay for you, you know, she admitted. That week was tight. Tighter than usual. I stood there doing math in my head before I stepped up, wondering if I could actually afford it. Why did you then? She smiled a little wistfully. My father used to tell me, never miss a chance to become someone's miracle. He didn't have much either, growing up, but he always found a way to help whoever needed it, even when helping cost him something real. I think about that a lot. I decided a long time ago I'd rather be a little tighter on money than let someone stand there embarrassed when I could do something about it. Eric reached over and took her hand, gently, the first time either of them had let that particular boundary fall. You changed my life that day, he said. Not because of anything you gave me financially. Because of what it reminded me I'd been missing. Michelle didn't pull her hand away. I think you changed something in me too, she said. I'd stopped expecting anyone to show up consistently the way you have. Noah adores you. I think, honestly, some part of me has too for a while now. Noah came running back at that exact moment, breathless and grinning, entirely unaware of what he just walked in on, though the small, satisfied smile he gave them both suggested he'd already decided, quietly in the way children do, that Eric belonged somewhere close to family. They sat together as the sun dropped lower over the gardens, hands still loosely joined, no cameras, no board meetings, no declined cards standing between them anymore, just an ordinary afternoon that felt, to both of them, like the beginning of something neither had expected to find. As they packed up the picnic blanket and Noah ran ahead toward the car, Michelle paused, looking back at the magnolia trees behind them. Can I ask you something? She said. Anything. When all of this settles down, the community center, whatever comes next, do you think you'll go back to disappearing into work the way you used to? Before any of this happened. Eric considered the question seriously, the way he considered most things Michelle asked him now, without rushing toward whatever answer sounded best. I don't think I can, he said. Not the way I used to. I think once you've had something real, it's hard to go back to pretending the version of your life without it was ever actually enough. Michelle smiled, folding the blanket over her arm. Good answer, she said. I mean it, Eric said. You and Noah didn't just change how I spend my mornings. You changed what I think success is supposed to feel like. And what does it feel like now? She asked. Eric looked toward Noah, still chasing ducks near the water's edge, laughing at nothing in particular, entirely unburdened by anything beyond the simple joy of the moment he was in. It feels like this, Eric said. Exactly like this. Michelle didn't say anything to that, but she didn't need to. She simply reached for his hand again as they walked toward the car, the three of them moving together through the fading gold light, in no particular hurry to get anywhere else. As they reached the parking lot, Noah ran ahead to press his face against the car window, already asking if they could stop for ice cream on the way home. Michelle laughed and told him they'd see, the same gentle deflection she'd used 100 times before, and Eric found himself struck by how ordinary the whole afternoon had been. No boardrooms, no negotiations, no calculated decisions about optics or timing. Just a woman, her son, and a man slowly learning that the best parts of his life had never actually required the fortune he'd spent decades building. Thank you, he said quietly as Michelle unlocked the car. For what? For today. For all of the ordinary days, actually. I don't think I understood what I was missing until I started having them with you. Michelle looked at him over the roof of the car, something warm and unguarded passing across her face. You're welcome, she said. Get in. Noah's not going to let either of us forget about that ice cream. Eric laughed, climbing into the passenger seat, and as they pulled out of the Botanical Gardens parking lot toward the promise of ice cream and an ordinary evening ahead, he understood, with a clarity that surprised him, exactly how much his definition of a good day had quietly rearranged itself since the morning his card had first failed at that counter. In the back seat, Noah hummed along to the radio, entirely content, while Michelle glanced once more at Eric beside her, a small, private smile settling over her face as the city lights began to flicker on around them. Several months later, the neighborhood gathered again, this time for the dedication of a brand new community center. One Eric had spent the better part of a year quietly building from the ground up. Instead of his own name across the entrance, the building carried different words entirely, carved into stone above the doors. The Harris Family Community Center. Michelle stood in the crowd, hand pressed to her mouth, as Eric explained to the gathered neighborhood what the building would offer. Childcare for working parents, job training programs, a full computer lab and after-school center, and a dedicated support program for single parents navigating exactly the kind of exhausting balancing act Michelle had lived for years. I've built companies, Eric said from the podium, his eyes finding Michelle in the crowd. I've built a fortune most people can't fully picture. But none of it compares to what began the day a stranger paid for my breakfast without knowing a single thing about who I was. He stepped down from the podium and crossed the small distance to where she stood, Noah beside her, watching with wide, curious eyes. I've spent my whole life quietly fixing problems from a safe distance, Eric said, taking her hand in front of the entire gathered crowd. You taught me what it actually costs to give something that matters. I don't want to build a future for this community without also building one with the two people who taught me why any of it was worth building in the first place. He knelt then, not with any grand theatrical flourish, simply with quiet, steady sincerity, and asked Michelle to marry him, promising in the same breath to love and show up for Noah exactly the way he'd been showing up for months already. Michelle, tears slipping freely down her face now, looked at Noah, who was already nodding enthusiastically before she'd even answered, and then back at Eric. Yes, she said, her voice breaking slightly around the word. Yes. The crowd erupted into applause loud enough to send a flock of birds scattering from the trees above the new building. Noah threw his arms around both of them at once, laughing, and for a moment none of them moved, simply standing together in the noise and the light, the weight of everything that had led them here finally settling into something that felt, unmistakably, like family. Later that evening, as the crowd thinned and the new community center's windows glowed warm against the darkening sky, Michelle found Eric standing near the entrance, looking back at the stone lettering above the door. You could have named it after yourself, she said. Most people would have. It was never about me, Eric said. It never should have been. It was about a woman who paid for a stranger's breakfast without asking a single question about who he was or what he could give her back. Michelle leaned into him, watching Noah race across the lawn with a group of neighborhood kids, laughter drifting across the grass in the cooling evening air. I guess a declined card really can change a person's whole life, she said. Eric smiled, pulling her closer. The best thing that ever happened to me, he said, was running out of money in front of a room full of strangers. Inside the new community center, the after-school room was already filling with the quiet hum of the following week's programming being set up. Shelves of books, a bank of new computers, a bulletin board Michelle had insisted on including specifically for kids to post their own achievements, however small. Noah found them a little while later, slightly out of breath from running, and tugged at Eric's sleeve. Are you really going to be my dad now? He asked, with the same blunt, unfiltered directness he'd used the very first day he'd asked Eric about bridges. Eric knelt down to Noah's height, the same way he had that very first afternoon at the diner counter, except this time there was nothing casual or accidental about the conversation ahead of them. If that's all right with you, Eric said. I'd like that very much. Noah considered this with the same careful seriousness he brought to his science projects. You have to keep helping with my bridges, he said finally. Even the boring engineering parts. Every single one, Eric promised. For as long as you'll let me. Noah grinned and threw his arms around Eric's neck, and over the boy's shoulder, Eric caught Michelle's eye, both of them smiling in the particular way people smile when they know, without needing to say it aloud, that everything that mattered had finally found its proper place. Outside, the last of the string lights flickered on across the lawn as the evening deepened, and somewhere beneath them, in the quiet architecture of an ordinary declined card and one woman's willingness to say I'll pay, an entire new life had already begun taking shape, sturdier, it turned out, than any bridge Noah could have built out of popsicle sticks, and built on exactly the same principle he'd been chasing all along, that the right kind of support, placed in exactly the right place can hold far more weight than anyone expects. Michelle stood at the entrance a while longer after most of the crowd had gone home, watching Eric and Noah stack chairs together near the podium, laughing about something she couldn't quite hear from where she stood. She thought about the woman she'd been the night the eviction. No, not an eviction, she corrected herself, that had been someone else's story, hers had simply been the ordinary grind of 2 jobs and careful budgeting. The woman who'd stood at a register with a stack of coupons, deciding whether she could spare $12 for a stranger's breakfast. She'd made that decision without knowing it would lead here. Without knowing any of this was possible. She thought, watching Eric fold a table with Noah's clumsy help, that maybe that was exactly the point. The smallest, most ordinary decisions were often the ones that ended up matter most, long after the moment itself had been forgotten by everyone except the 2 people it had quietly, permanently changed. Wealth can buy comfort. It has never once been able to buy compassion. True character reveals itself not in boardrooms or headlines, but in the quiet, ordinary moments when no one is watching and nothing is expected in return. Sometimes the greatest love stories in the world begin with something as small as a declined card, and someone brave enough to say, I'll pay. If this story reminded you that kindness always finds its way back around, you know exactly what to do. Drop a comment if you believe in strangers who show up when it matters most. Hit like, follow for the next story, and share this with someone who still believes good people are out there, because they are.